This is It's an Inside Job, and I'm your host, Jason Lim. This is the show where we explore the stories, strategies, and science behind growing resilience, nurturing well-being, and leading with intent. Because when it comes down to it, it's all an inside job. Well, welcome back to the show. Have you ever wondered how faith, not just a religious sense, but a deeper human drive, how it can help us stay grounded during change, complexity, loss, and uncertainty? Well, in this episode, I sit down with Dr. Amir Hussain. He's a professor of Theological Studies at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles. He has over 2 decades of experience teaching, writing, and engaging in interfaith dialogue. And in this conversation, he brings a unique perspective of how faith, community, and storytelling shape resilience. We explore how rituals help us process grief, how doubt can deepen scientific and spiritual understanding, and why storytelling isn't just cultural, it's neurological. Amir also shares insights from his book, One God, Two Religions, which tackles tough questions about the relationship between Islam and Christianity and challenges the fear-driven narratives that often dominate public discourse. Whether religious, spiritual, or simply curious about how people find strength in uncertain times, I think you'll find this conversation offers something valuable. It's a reminder that our shared stories, mutual respect, and doubt can bring us closer together, especially when you consider the tumultuous times that we are in 2025. So without further ado, let's slip into the stream and meet Dr. Amir Hussain. Well, I'd like to welcome everyone back to the show. Today we're going to be exploring the role of faith, not just in religious terms, but as a deep source of personal resilience, community growth, and mental well-being, especially during times of change, challenge, and complexity. And today I'd like to welcome Dr. Amir Hussain. Amir, welcome to the show.
Lovely to be on here, Jason. Thank you for having me.
You have a long list of accolades and degrees and such. I was wondering, could you give us a brief introduction as to who you are and what you currently do?
Sure. So to start at the beginning, born in Pakistan, working class kid, came to Canada when I was 4 years old, and I grew up in Toronto. So literally all my education, kindergarten to PhD, was in Toronto. Both my parents worked in factories. Now we talk about first to go, the first kid in the family to go to university. That was me. And you were a smart kid, you were a child of immigrants. And so you had 4 career paths. You could be a doctor, you could be a lawyer, you could be an engineer, you could run your own business, and that was it, And so my thing was, I was a smart kid in high school. I want to be a doctor. Your parents want you to, succeed. You want to be a doctor. You go to university, and pretty much within the first week, there was this idea of, wait, there's this thing called intellectual. Like that's a thing. You can get paid to read and write. If you had asked me in high school, do you want to be a teacher when you grow up? All I would have known was high school teaching. I said no, because I saw what my friends did to high school teachers, and it was not pleasant. You go to university, completely different. It was like, wait, this is a job? How do I get this job? Well, you need a PhD. Well, what's a PhD? And so you switch over. We'll get into this, I think, a little bit later. But my undergraduate degree was in psychology with a minor in English. And it was the minor in English that helped me to understand about religion. You had to know the Bible if you want to know English literature. But I didn't know the Bible, so you take a course in that. And then you think, well, I'm a Muslim, and I don't know much about my own religion other than, growing up in it. Maybe I should learn about that. And that switched me over. So undergrad degree in psychology, master's, PhD in religion, got a job, fortunately, when I graduated at California State University, Northridge, in the part of the Cal State system in the San Fernando Valley. So first time, moving out of Toronto to LA, moved to LA in 97. I loved teaching there, like state school, all the universities, except I think one in Canada are state universities. And you saw the transformative power of education that, my parents worked in factories. They have a high school education. My sister's an engineer. I'm a professor. education transforms your lives. I loved working in that state system, but every year, because it's a state-funded institution, sometimes there's good money, sometimes there's not good money, more students, fewer resources. But they brought in a chancellor who said very famously that he saw the California State University system. And it's funny what you remember from 20 years ago, as I quote, creating educated workers for the California workforce. And I thought, I thought I was trying to create educated citizens for the world, not workers for California. Don't get me wrong. I want people, when they get a university, get a job. That's important. But I'm not training you in a narrow vocational saying nothing wrong with it. You want to be a welder, go to welding school. You want to be an accountant, go to this school. They'll help you become an accountant. I can't help you with that. I'm not good with numbers. I'm training you to how to think, understand things. And so the opportunity came up to say, okay, well, is there a place that actually does try to create educated citizens for the world? And it was the Jesuit University in California. Like I knew the Jesuits as an order of the Catholic Church, but didn't know much about them. I knew about Georgetown University, a basketball fan in the 80s. So about, Georgetown basketball. And then you think, oh, these folks have been doing education for 400 years. They understand this. And so, long answer to your question, for the last 20 years, I've been teaching at Loyola Marymount University, which is the private Jesuit university in Los Angeles. So, if you'd asked me 30 years ago when I'm doing my PhD, do you see yourself teaching at a Jesuit school in Los Angeles? I'd say, why would I leave Toronto? Toronto's a great city, Jesuit school. I'm not even a Christian. Why would I teach in a Catholic school? Only Catholics go to Catholic schools. And you realize, hey, maybe the Catholic school is a really good place to try and develop people to become educated citizens for the world.
And our mutual friend, Jim Gifford, introduced us. I've never been a man of faith per se. I've always more towards the secular. Even in sort of my darkest hours, I've always turned to sort of inner resources. But I've always been curious as to the other side of the fence, per se, irregardless of what faith that would be. And that is why I want to talk to someone who's educated, who has a faith, who has a deep knowledge, not just in the Muslim faith, but across the different faiths, a theologian per se in many different fields. And I wanted to talk to you today to have a frank conversation to understand religion has been in its different forms with us since we banged rocks together in some form or another, and it's evolved into different disciplines per se, or faiths. I want to know how people turn towards faith to find resilience, to find sort of an inner sanctitude, to find in these tumultuous times, and how that can sometimes bring us become the steady rock that we sometimes need in such turbulent times that we find ourselves today, Amir. So I guess my first question to ask you is, across these traditions that you've studied and that you've delved into, faith often acts as an anchor during uncertainty and hardship. From your experience, what are some of the ways, the universal ways that faith helps individuals build resilience?
Yeah, that's a great question. And Jason, you hit it right on the head when you said, ever since we've been human, we've been religious. My mentor was the great Wilfred Cantwell Smith, this extraordinary Canadian scholar, really the best Canadian scholar of religion, like in the 20th century. Founded the Institute for Islamic Studies at McGill, got hired away to Harvard, directed the Center for the Study of World Religions at Harvard for 20 years, retired back to Toronto. That's where we met. And he has this essay that I assigned to my students where he's basically in front of a new museum in Jerusalem, where they have, one of the early human beings they found in Jerusalem, 150,000 years old, who's buried very carefully and thoughtfully in a way that tells us that the community that buried him, took some care with this, buried him in a particular way, buried him with particular objects. And he says, look, I have no idea who buried this person. I have no idea what the rituals they did to bury this person. I know clearly they did this thoughtfully and carefully. It wasn't just a disposal of a body off a cliff or, just randomly burying it or something like that. It was very carefully thought out. And what he said has stayed with me all my life. He says, the proper response to death is poetry, not prose. I use that as a way of starting with what you asked me about, because, I'm a scientific person too. My undergraduate degree is a Bachelor of Science. Science is really important. My best friend's a vascular surgeon. You trust the science, you understand those things. But that's the prose part, and nothing wrong with that. Where's the poetry part? And so to your question, I think faith, the Quran, so I'm a Muslim, the Quran, the scripture for Muslims talks about the organ of faith not being, and I'm pointing to my head, not being the brain, but the heart. It's a visceral thing. There's a line in the Quran, probably my favorite line, where a group of Arab Bedouin, pre-Islamic Arab Bedouin, come to the Prophet Muhammad and say, we have the Arabic iman, we have faith. And the Prophet's command to say, no, don't say you have faith. Say instead you have Islam, you have submitted, because faith has not yet entered your hearts. And that's that idea that you do the right thing. Well, there's lots of reasons to do the right thing. Do you do the right thing for the right reason? That's faith. And I think that's the key, that for so many people in times of distress, in times of great loss, when you deal with a death, we're both old enough that we buried enough, people, and that understanding that, okay, I know how the human body works. I know how the human body decomposes. I know what happens in the process of embalming and everything else. And they put the body in the casket, and the casket goes in the ground. Or a Jewish funeral. Jewish funerals, no embalming, very simple wooden casket. You decompose back to the earth. I know exactly from my scientific friends how that body breaks down, how that decomposes, at what point, the flesh is taken off, how not to be crude, but how the bugs eat it and all that kind of stuff.
For sure.
That doesn't help me deal with the death. That doesn't help me deal with the loss. That's where faith comes in. Do you think that, this person has died and I'm never going to see them again? Or do you think this person has died and I'm never going to see them again in this form, but I'm still going to think about them? I'm still going to have a conversation with them. They may have a conversation with me. I was having this conversation with a friend the other day, and then this is another example that dreams. We think of dreams, and psychology major, we think of dreams, especially post-Freud, especially in the Western world, as a product of our unconsciousness, as a product of sometimes neuroses. You struggle with these things during the day. Your unconscious mind, is dealing with it while your conscious mind is worried about, how do I pay the bills and get the kids from soccer practice or whatever. Mm-hmm. Then you go to sleep, and the unconscious mind takes over, and all those things percolate up. That's the sort of Western understanding of dreams, both in the Islamic and the traditional, meaning pre-modern Western understanding. That's not what dreams are. Dreams are a different plane. They're a different plane of existence. To use, I live in LA, so Hollywood film metaphors. If you know The Matrix, a series of films, it's the construct program, where Morpheus meets with Neo, and they load these programs, and he does all these things. This is that place where we can sort of meet outside of the Matrix. The
cascading
although
code.
We're still exactly doing this kind of stuff there. But you understand things, like things are revealed. To meet the prophet in a dream was as much value as meeting him in person. You look at the great, story in Christianity of Paul, the follower of Jesus, who has this vision of the risen Christ. That's a dream, that's a vision. And so I think, to your question, I think faith often helps us in this kind of way, because sometimes it speaks to the non-rational part. Sometimes it speaks to the visceral part. I mean, we've all had the experience where I know in my head what I'm supposed to do, but in my heart, I can't do that, and you think, okay, where am I leading? What's going on? What is leading me here? And then religious folks will talk about, the Jesuits talk about consolation and desolation. Like, in your actions, consolation isn't just, being consoled and being happy. It's like, does this move you in a direction to God? Desolation, does this move you away from God? If you're being a religious, faithful person, are you doing things that help other people and help the community? Because religion has done a lot of that. Now, are you doing things that have been really horrible? Because religious folks have done some horrible things to other folks. And so it's that sense of, where are you moving? Are you moving in connection with people? Are you helping people? Are you moving away from that, and trying to use people and hurt people and do those kinds of things? And of course, religious people have done that all along. And then the other thing, I'll stop here, is that I don't mean to say that it's only faithful people that do these kinds of things. I have really good friends who are atheists who don't believe in religion, don't believe in God, believe this is it. You have your, 70, 80, 90 years of life. And that's it. When you're gone, you're gone. But you still treat people well. You still treat people decently. You still want to have, some kind of legacy that you leave behind, whether it's a scholarship at a university or, with our friend Jim Gifford, who's this great publisher with, 100 great books that he's published. That's the legacy. That's how his name is going to live on as this publisher, editor of these amazing books. I hope that a little bit for me is that, some students at some point might mention me in passing and say, okay, that's how you're remembered, And so I think, it's not let me stop here. It's not an either or, like religion or science or religion or lack of religion or faith. It's a both and. This helps us, I think, helps many of us.
Well, what I found fascinating, you have sort of faith practices such as rituals and prayers and storytelling. And you find a lot of this in the psychologies, or especially clinical psychologies or cognitive behavior psychologies, where we call them different things, but I think they're based on the same underlying mechanism. But these faith practices, they've been around, again, for thousands upon thousands of years in different formats, under different religions, whatever those may be. From your perspective, how do they contribute to mental and emotional well-being?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think for so many of us, those rituals, first of all, just help us deal with things. If you know what to do, or if you know what people need, you've been seeing people die for a while. You see this. And so, I happen to be a Muslim, but let me talk about, Jewish practices. When someone dies in the Jewish tradition, you're observant Jew, what do? Well, you sit Shiva with them. The idea is that the person who's had this loss is literally not in their right minds. They don't know what's going on. And so they need people with them, literally to help them. I mean, you have those sort of moments of deep loss. And so just my own story, when I was in university, met this extraordinary woman, we get married in 1989, 1992, she dies of a pulmonary embolism, bilateral pulmonary embolism, blood clot. And I have to deal with this death of this person that I was married to less than 3 years ago. And I don't know how I got through that first week without my friends, the people that would just come by the house and say, how are you doing? What's going on? Okay, well, did you eat anything? Well, maybe I had an apple this morning. Well, okay, it's 4:00 in the afternoon. Maybe we should go and get some lunch. Oh, okay, yeah, maybe, And one of those things I learned was, when people are grieving, don't send them a floral arrangement. Send them a fruit basket, because you don't eat. You don't think about eating, So maybe if there's like a fruit basket or some nuts, they might have that. Where I'm going with this is that I wouldn't have survived that first week without my friends. That's Shiva. You sit with people, you're with them, you feed them, you take care of them, you watch them. And then, a week later, you have the burial. And then what do? Well, every day for the next month in the Jewish tradition, you say this prayer, the Kaddish prayer, which is this unique prayer for the dying that never mentions the dead or dying. It's a praise of God, both in the Jewish tradition, the Islamic tradition, for that matter, the Christian tradition. The proper function of human beings is to praise their creator. So that this prayer, this Kaddish, is a praise of God. And if you're observant, you say it 3 times a day, every day for that first month. And in a funny way, most of my Jewish friends, or religious Jewish friends, are either Reform or conservative, sometimes Reconstruction, maybe not adoption. None of them, only a few of them are Orthodox Jews. It's amazing how many of my Jewish friends start going to the Orthodox synagogue, because the Orthodox synagogue is the place that does those 3 prayers every day in community. And so you do this. And then at the anniversary, of the death. You have this ritual. You typically light a candle. You do some other things. The first holiday after the person has died, there's a ritual. We just celebrated Passover. In the Jewish tradition, and as part of the rituals of Passover, you recite the Kaddish, and the people who've had a death in the last year, they stand and they're there and they're consoled by the community. And so I think back to your question, Jason. These rituals often help us in really interesting psychological and physiological ways. Like I said, that first week when someone has experienced a death, especially a close death, a spouse, partner, heaven forbid, a child, a parent, it's that sense of, you're not in your right mind. Someone's got to take care of you. You can't just, deal with this. And so someone to help you deal with the stuff, work with the stuff, and then as you process that grief.
If I may just interject there, I mean, when in the Shiva or when they do the practice of 3 times a day of the Jewish faith and such, what do you think the psychological benefit of that? I mean, from your perspective, what is the reason this came to fruition as part of the ritual, as part of the faith?
Yeah, so I think that the chief psychological benefit, and this is whether you're a religious person or not, is our deep connection to and with each other. I think that's been one of the real dangers of the modern world, especially the post-COVID world, where we don't see ourselves as connected communities, where we see ourselves as individuals in our own home. And I say this to my students all the time. Look, I'm a city kid, which means I've always depended on other people. Like, food comes the way God intended it from the supermarket. Meat comes the way God intended it, on a styrofoam tray wrapped in plastic. Like, if you give me a cow and a cleaver, I'm a vegetarian.
Sorry.
No, I got no idea how to kill this thing. I got no idea where the New York strip is. You give me a New York strip, I'll do wonders.
Yeah.
I can't take that from someone has done this work. Like, you grow up in a city, someone has built the water pipes. I'm drinking a cup of coffee. I didn't make that coffee. The nice lady Lavangene who makes my coffee, she made the coffee for me. We're connected to each other. So I think the point is these rituals reestablish that. They tell us that we're not by ourselves. We like to think, oh, I'm an individual. I can do this myself. I can't. I'm sitting in a chair that someone else made. I'm talking to you through a computer that someone else made. We're using a program that someone wrote. I'm in a building that someone else built. We're deeply, deeply dependent on each other. We like to think that we're not. We like to think that we did this all ourselves, and so I think part of the function of the ritual is precisely that sense of connection. How do you connect with each other? How do you understand that we're part of a larger whole? We're part of a community. I mean, that Kaddish prayer has to be prayed in a community, and traditionally the minyan is 10 people. That it's not just that 3 people aren't enough or 7 people aren't enough. It's that you're a community of people. You're not just one individual. And so I think some of the answer to it is very much that sense of community. Some of the sense of it is precisely the psychological kinds of things. So, you experience, and let's stick with that death. You experience a close death. Well, you're thinking about that person all the time. And so how do you, at specific points in the day, get a chance to do that, to say, okay, I'm going to say this prayer in the morning. I'm going to say this prayer in the afternoon. I'm going to say this prayer in the evening. I'm going to say this prayer in community, back to what I said before. So that there's people with me who understand this, who understand that, I need to talk about this person. And the danger that we have, I think, again, in the modern Western world is, you're lucky if you have like 3 days of bereavement leave, like from work, and the idea, well, you buried your father on Saturday. Well, it's Monday, get back to work. And it's like, I can't function, right? I can't function the same way. It's going to take me a while to get back to where I was. And so I think that sense of how do you do this? How do you rebuild? And, but my undergrad degrees, I mentioned before, psychology, worked with people with behavioral issues, worked with people with head injuries with behavior problems, worked with developmentally handicapped kids, doing sort of behavioral therapy. And a lot of it is, how do you teach new responses? Action that has been reinforced in the past will likely to occur again in the future. How do you create new behaviors? If you've got a kid that, throws rocks, or if you got someone that smokes, how do you teach them a new behavior to, deal with the stress? And so I think that's what this does. That's what these rituals do. It's in that sense very much in the psychological behavioral world. How do you create new patterns of behavior? How do you understand that, this person that you loved isn't there anymore? And you see this, like I had that with a friend, whose dad died, unfortunately, during COVID. And the dad did everything. The mom literally didn't know how to pay the bills. She literally did not know how to pay the phone bill, because the father did that. Her job was to, stay at home and take care of the kids and go to the supermarket. And, she had the bank card to buy the groceries with. She would come home and, but, all of a sudden, like, these letters keep coming. What do I do? Like that kind of thing. How do you teach someone, oh, these are the bills. Now dad's gone. You're going to have to pay these bills now. How do you do that? And that's just the mechanical, like, how do you keep your lights on and the electricity running in your house? Forget about how do you deal with the emotional stuff to be able to go back and, go to work, take care of your kids. But I think, back to your question, that's ritual.
Yeah. And so the sense of ritual can give a sense of certainty, a sense of control over a situation as we process the loss or process the complexity of the change we're going through. And so for me, storytelling has always been, whether it's within religious faith or from, handed down generation to generation. Would you say storytelling in sort of the religious sphere, is it a way of obviously passing on knowledge, but, communities go through pandemics, they go through migration, they go through some sort of tragedy or trauma, but those stories get passed down from generation to generation. So is storytelling through the religious faith, is that one way to share, this is how our ancestors or our forefathers dealt with this situation, and thus we can learn from their lessons?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think storytelling, and we may talk about it as myth making. And when I use the term myth, I don't mean a false story. Myth, mythoi in Greek, is literally a story. It doesn't matter whether it's a true story or a false story. And we often can learn from stories that we know are false. The Christmas Carol story, Scrooge, Tiny Tim, Bob Cratchit, that's fake. That came out of Charles Dickens' head. But that helps many of us to think, okay, how do I behave in the world? Am I behaving in the way like Scrooge? Am I thankful? Do I see my community? Do I take care of my employees? And so this idea that a fictional story, a Christmas Carol, can help real people actually, work in the world. So storytelling, I think, is really, really important. Part of it, as you said, Jason, is precisely that. We've been dealing with death since we've been human beings. We've been dealing with loss since we've been human beings. What do we do with the birth of a child? And it doesn't have to be terrible things. It can be beautiful things. What do we do with the birth of a child? How do we raise children? You're a parent, and all of a sudden the doctors, congratulations, Mr. Smith, here's your child. What do I do? How do I deal with this kid? My life has completely changed now.
Does it come with a manual, right?
Well, exactly. And those stories, but in a funny way, I think that's it. Those stories are the kind of manual. What do you do? How do you do this? Because we've been here. We've done this kind of thing. Now, it's new for the person. The first time you lose someone is the first time you lose someone. It's brand new for you. But we've been losing people for 1,000 years. The first time you have a kid is a new thing for you, but we've been having kids for thousands of years. And so I think those stories are really, really important to help us, make sense of the world. So one of my dear friends is this marvelous, English professor at U of T, the University of Toronto, Edward Chamberlain, Ted Chamberlain. And one of his great books is a book called If This Is Your Land, Where Are Your Stories? And that's set in a land claims case. So Ted was involved with the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, especially, land claims over the last 20 years in British Columbia. And the line comes from a elder who's in a court case because it's a land claims issue, and the crown, of course, has a piece of paper that says so and so sold this land to Captain so and so in 1826, and so here's the ownership of the land, and one of the elders gets up and says to the judge those words: "If this is your land, where are your stories?" We know that we're connected to this land. We know we've been in this land 10,000 years because we've told stories about this land and what happens at that mountain, or what happens in this season, or where this spring is when we really need water. We have these stories about this place. That's what connects us to this place. And the government of Canada, in one of it's rare, governments often don't do amazing, wonderful things, but in this case they did, where the government of Canada said that, okay, we're going to recognize oral testimony with the same, oral history, with the same level as we do the written precedent record, to say that, yeah, we don't have a piece of paper that says, we were given this land or we bought this land in 1826. We've been living in this land for the last 15,000 years, and we have stories that tell us that we've been living on this land for 15,000 years. Do those have equal weight to the sort of written testimony, the piece of paper that's the precedence there? And so I think like the fact that even in Canadian law, we're seeing the importance of stories.
In the first half of my conversation with Dr. Amir Hussain, we explored how faith, beyond religious doctrine, how it can play a vital role in building personal resilience, strengthening communities, and supporting mental well-being, especially in times of uncertainty and upheaval. Amir, who came to Canada as a young child from Pakistan, shared how growing up as the son of immigrants shaped his understanding of belonging, identity, and spiritual growth. We also traced the fascinating journey from wanting to become a doctor to studying psychology, and ultimately finding his calling in religious studies. Amir explained how this shift wasn't just academic, but deeply personal. He credited mentors like Wilfred Cantwell Smith for shaping his view that faith is not about blind belief, but how we find meaning and purpose, especially in the face of death or suffering. Smith's idea that poetry can be a spiritual response to death, it struck a chord within me. There's something timeless and deeply human, something profound about turning to words and rituals during our most challenging moments. And that brought us to the role of rituals in grief. Amir talked about how practices like the Jewish tradition of seating Shiva offer structured community support that many modern societies lack. He emphasized that rituals, whether daily prayer, lighting a candle, or coming together with others, how it helps us process grief gradually rather than pushing us to move on too quickly. Now, these shared moments remind us that we're not alone. Amir made the case that real faith isn't about having all the answers. It's about asking the questions that matter. In religious and scientific traditions, doubt can sharpen understanding and strengthen conviction rather than tearing it down. So now let's slip back into the stream with part 2 of my conversation with Dr. Amir Hussain. And I'd just like to segue to talk about, if you don't mind, about the interplay between faith and doubt. When many of us experience some sort of crisis, we start, for those of faith, may start believing, why hast thou forsaken me, per se, in those kind of words. But how can doubt sometimes actually deepen rather than diminish our people's faith and resilience?
Yeah, no, but it's a great question, Jason. Thank you. I start my comparative theology classes with this fancy word, theodicy. Theodicy, literally the problem of suffering. Why do the righteous suffer? If God is good, if God is powerful, if God is just, why do the righteous suffer?
Is that the term, theosity?
It's theodicy.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Really the problem of theodicy. Righteous suffering.
Righteous suffering.
And it's a very real question. If, like I said, if the basic premise of many religions is A, there's a God, B, that God is good, C, that God is all powerful, why do people who are righteous and good suffer? Why do the wicked? We see that all the time. the really good people who are completely hard done by, the terrible people that, get all the benefits and luxuries and things like that. And you think, how could this happen? And then you think about, the horrific kinds of things like the Holocaust. You think about, genocide, ethnic cleansing, tribes being wiped out, all like, how can this happen to us? How do we make sense of this? And I think the idea here is that's one question. The faith and doubt thing I think is really interesting because doubt is normal. Doubt is a good thing. Like I think for a lot of religious folks, they think that, faith means complete and utter understanding, belief, giving it over, blind obedience, kind of thing. That's not what it is, because again, like faith is, and I'm pointing to my chest. Faith is an interior, visceral thing. It's a felt thing. It's a heart thing. It's not a belief thing. It's not. I'm pointing to my head here. It's not a brain. It's not a thinking, kind of thing there. Like you have this feeling. You have this, and it's funny because we say the phrase gut feeling, and now again, my friends who are medical researchers, talk all the time about, okay, we've done a lot of work now with our gut, like what happens in the gut, whether it's microbes in the gut, with other things in the gut. What does it mean that our gut actually does some really interesting things in our body that isn't just about digestion, And so those kinds of, like what a gut feeling is. And so, like, for example, in the Quran, the person who does not believe, kufr, and we have the phrase kafir that comes out, non-believer, really means person without faith. The opposite of faith, the opposite of disbelief or doubt is thankfulness, and so I think that's the key. The idea is that the person who doesn't believe is the one who is not thankful, and we understood being, thankful to God. And so I think that's the issue here, that, clearly things will happen. Clearly things will happen that will challenge you. We talk about that. I grew up in a university world in which we learned in psychology class of, Thomas Kuhn, the structure of scientific revolutions, paradigm shifts. We think that the earth is the center of the universe. Then someone says, it makes a lot more sense if we think of the earth as going around the sun rather than everything revolving around the earth. It makes more sense if we think of things this way than that way. And you completely, shift the paradigm. You change things. You have to reorient. You have to rethink stuff there. I mean, we look at what we've done just in the last, 100 years or so with flight. I mean, and flight is, a little more than 100 years old. And you look at the Wright brothers, flying like what they fly like 100 yards and 10 feet off the ground. And now, I can get, forget about military, supersonic fighter jets. The fact that I can fly across the country in, 4 hours, is extraordinary. Here completely changes the paradigm. And so absolutely things happen, whether they're good or bad, what do you do when your child dies? What do you do when your village is wiped out? What do you do when there's a pandemic? How do you make sense of the world? And that goes back, I think, Jason, your point about storytelling is so important. We have these stories. We tell these stories because guess what? There have been other pandemics. Guess what? There have been other people. I mean, every experience is unique. But guess what? There have been other people who've lost, a loved one. How do we make sense of this? How do we understand this? Which doesn't then mean you say, okay, I can't deal with this anymore. Now some people do it. And again, sticking with the Jewish example, the Holocaust, for so many Jews, it's like, but how can this happen? We are the chosen people of God. We are called by God to live apart, to be holy, to live different lives than the rest of the world, because we are the chosen ones of God. And a third of us, fully a third of the Jewish community during the Holocaust is wiped out. How can this be? How can we have faith? And for many Jews, it was like, I can't believe, like, how can there be a God? There can't be a God anymore. For others, there's a sense of, no, we still have to go on. We still have to do this, because again, in the past, there were people who wanted to kill us. In the past, there were people who tried to wipe us out, this king of Babylon, this king of Persia, all those kinds of things, And so I think again, this is a way of making sense of the world. And in that sense, whether you're talking about scientific doubt or religious doubt, doubt is important. You have to question. I say to my students all the time, and I'll stop here, in the beginnings of theology classes, like, yeah, the point of this exercise is to ask questions. I'm not scared of a person who asks questions. I'm scared of the person who has no questions, who has no doubt, who has complete. That's the person I'm scared of. Of course you have to have doubt. Of course, I don't have the answers. I have questions. That's why I've been studying this for 30 years.
I completely concur. I completely concur. I think critical thinking is a necessary skill as we move deeper into the 21st century, and especially the chaos of the next 25 years, that kicked off this year. And I'd like to segue, because I think you made a very interesting point, because we can see a dichotomy, and I think it's a kind of a false dichotomy, but I'd like to get your perspective between what science is, this general area of science, and this general area of religion. And a lot of the times when you hear debates or talks about it, they are completely divided, an ocean between them. But one thing you've just said to me, which I concur, is that in whether it's religion or whether it's science, asking questions is a good thing. Doubt allows us to see that. That's part of what critical thinking is, because then it allows us to understand the underlying mechanism behind something, or to understand the string of knowledge or the understanding that becomes the infrastructure to hold something up, if it's a belief or a scientific hypothesis or theory. I was wondering if you could sort of riff on that and maybe elaborate from your perspective.
Yeah. No, and again, like I've said this before, my undergrad degree is a Bachelor of Science. I think science is important. I was so thankful that, at the University of Toronto, psychology was a science. Third year, we had to do statistics. Fourth year, we had to do experimental design. Fourth year, you had to do an experimental, you had to do an experiment that you could write up as if it was going to a APA journal. And so it was a scientific method, that's really important. And so when you have these anecdotal kinds of things of someone says, well, this, I'm like, yeah, well, what's the end? Like, how many subjects were they randomly chosen? What did happen there? Is it an actual trial? Is it a placebo effect? Is it this kind of thing? I think those things are really important. Is this statistically significant? Yes, 4 people, this happened to 4 people, but is that statistically significant? It may be, it may not be, depending on who the people are, what happened there. And so I think the scientific part is really, really important. I think the danger is, and I go back to my teacher, Wilfred Cantwell Smith. He has this great line, and he's talking about religion, not about science, but I'll apply it to science in a second. He says, when you're comparing religions, normally people tend to see other people's religions as they are and their own as they ought to be. It's the aspirational kind of thing. It's the comparison of, oh yeah, Pope Francis just died. Pope Francis was an extraordinary human being. If you're comparing Pope Francis to Osama bin Laden, guess what? Pope Francis is a much greater human being than bin Laden was. Don't compare the terrorist in one religion to the saint in the other. Don't say, Christianity is much better than Islam because, look, we have Pope Francis in Christianity and you have bin Laden in Islam. I'm like, yeah, you got Timothy McVeigh in Christianity. You've got, so are we comparing, apples to apples?
We can cherry pick anything, right?
Right, exactly. Yeah. But that's the religion science thing. That's where I'm going with this, is that oftentimes we will point to religious people who do stupid things, forgive my saying that, and use that as an example of religion. We will talk about scientists, who fake their data and, all sorts of cases there, and realize and say, oh yeah, that's science. Again, no, that's cherry picking. So let's not cherry pick. Let's look at, what science is, what religion is. And I think they're both attempts to help us understand our world in very different ways. But I've said this to you before, that I always say to my students that science is important. Science helps us to ask, in many ways, the how questions. How does this happen? How did this start? How did this pandemic begin? Religion ask the why questions, not how does life on earth begin? Why does life on earth begin? That's a separate question. That's a different question. And so I think, we see oftentimes science and religion, especially, and I say this as someone who's living in America and quite concerned about some of the ways in which America is going more to a literal fundamentalist interpretation of a particular religious tradition, which then sets public policy. And it's like, wait, that's the scary part is first of all, you're not dealing with the complexity of the Christian experience. You're not dealing with the experience of those of us who are not Christian, who happen to be Muslim, Hindu, Jewish, atheist, whatever. But that sense of, the science tells us this, and you have to do those kinds of things. You look as we're speaking. One of the big issues, not just here and in the U.S., but starting unfortunately happen in Canada, measles outbreak, vaccines, this kind of thing, and this idea that I'll just give my kid cod liver oil and I'll pray and he'll be fine. I'm like, no, give him the vaccine, like. That's important. Like I said, my best friend's a vascular surgeon. There are times when prayer helps. There are times when prayer does things. There are times when you need a surgeon to go in and cut out the cancer. That's really crucial here. And so at what level is it just, it can't be, this goes back to our previous conversation about blind faith, about lack of any kind of doubt, to say you can't have that blind obedience, whether you're a scientist or a theologian. The science only advances when we actually start looking at the data and don't try to make the data fit our theories. That's bad science. Good science is, let's look at this data, and this data is actually challenging something, or this data is showing me that I should go in this direction. And the sort of purely accidental discoveries, like we all know the penicillin, kind of thing of, here's this moldy bread that's been left, and here's this thing, and here's this guy that notices, wait a minute, there's something different about this. Maybe we can cultivate it. Maybe we can do this. Or I said this to my best friend who's a vascular surgeon. The advancement that saved more lives over the last 200 years than any medical advancement is soap and water. It's doctors washing their hands. It's the germ theory. Wait, you're telling me there's tiny little things on my fingers, and those can be transmitted from touching one patient to another patient? Who knew this? You invent the microscope. You do these kinds of things. You do this sort of tests and say, this is why we need to wash. This is why surgeons wash their hands and put on gloves.
Yeah, just riffing on what you're saying. This was several years ago, but I read something about the Dalai Lama. He goes to the practicing faithful in Buddhism. He says, our faith goes back, whatever it is, 4,000 years or what have you. But if science teaches us something else, even though we've been believing something for 4,000 years, but if the science, without a doubt, shows us something else, then this is where we need to shift our belief in a certain way, in a certain direction, based on what is contemporary understanding of certain things. And I found that such refreshing thing, especially from a secular perspective that I tend to walk around with. I found that such a refreshing way of looking things. And this is where I saw not a division, but a confluence of both the religious belief per se, in this case Buddhism, but how science can adapt to how they can go hand in hand, maybe hand in glove per se.
No, absolutely. And I think, again, a good, healthy religion like Buddhism, like the Buddhism Dalai evolves, changes. It's not static. Again, in my theology class, next thing I say, is if you're going to learn one thing in this class, it's that there's no one way to be anything. You talk about a Buddhist. Well, what kind of Buddhist? Where? When? We used to think this. Now we think that. To use an example close to home here, you look at the Bible, especially the New Testament, demons inhabit the world. The Jesus in Mark's gospel casts out demons, And we can say that, that was a pre-modern thing. We, of course, as scientific, rational people, know that demons don't exist in the world. These were people who are mentally ill. These were people that psychological, whatever. Well, that's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it is like, what if you do believe that there's actual evil in the world? And so the Catholic Church, as we all know from, the Bill Friedkin movie, The Exorcist, does exorcisms. And many people think that, what a quaint old superstition, kind of thing. Like, there are no demons in the world. Little girls aren't possessed by demons or that kind of thing. Well, now, if you're a Catholic and you go to your priest and say, Father, I think my daughter is possessed by demons, if the priest is a good priest, to say, okay, have you gone to your pediatrician? Let's schedule an appointment. Let's go to your family doctor. Let's see what physiological issues are there with your child, And then after that, it's like, okay, Now let's go to the psychologist. Let's see if there's any psychological reasons, for why your child is behaving in the way your child is. It's only when you've eliminated, the medical and psychological, then you might start thinking about the spiritual, causes. And so, but again, this point of it's not that, oh, yeah, my child's possessed by demons. Oh, let's call in the exorcist. Like, no. The first thing the Catholic priest is going to say is let's call in the pediatrician. Then they're going to say, let's call in the psychologist. Let's call in the child psychiatrist. The exorcist is like the fifth call that we make. But again, it's that kind of thing there that, do you understand that, yes, we used to think of demons and people possessed by demons. Now we understand both psychiatric issues, people with certain medical problems that cause hallucinations or this kind of thing, or people with really deep-seated psychological issues or trauma, all those kinds of things. That's what's resulting in this behavior, not a demon, and I think that's a great example of, you have to follow, what's out there, what's available. I'm, as a religious person, I pray, you sort of pray for people, but you also ask them to go to the doctor. If a friend has heart disease, it's like, okay, I'll be praying for your well-being, but I also hope you go see your cardiologist. I also hope you follow what your cardiologist tells you, because that's important there. We have that knowledge.
I would, just respectful of your time, Amir, I'd like to segue over to your latest book, actually, one of many, but One God and Two Religions, where you explore the relationship between Islam and Christianity. I guess a kickoff question is, what inspired you to write it, and why now?
Yeah, thank you, Jason. That's a great question. I appreciate the chance to talk about the book. And so, I've written a number of books about Islam, Muslims, world religions, and I wrote a book in 2006 about Islam because that was post 9/11, and after 9/11, after the terrorist attacks, especially here in America, where so many Americans did not know about Islam and Muslims and what they saw. If all you know of Islam is Osama bin Laden, that's a horrible religion because that's a horrible person. How do you make sense of this? And then, and again, you think it sort of gets better, that 20 years after 9/11, people know more about Islam, things happen, they know their neighbors. You have all sorts of Muslims that are doing extraordinary kinds of things. And so like Mahershala Ali, actor, I Live in Hollywood, wins 2 Academy Awards, first American Muslim to win not just 1, but 2 Academy Awards. You look at, the sort of television shows now with like Rami Youssef or Mo, different people on the news, like, Ali Velshi having a television show in Toronto or in Canada for that matter, for several years. The CBC had a woman who wore hijab as never as a kid in 1970 did I think I would see a woman in hijab be the anchor for the CBC News, and so you have that kind of how do I say it? Muslims much more in the mainstream. But there's still that sort of Islamophobia. There's still those things. And so 2016, when then Canada, Donald Trump says very famously, in March to Anderson Cooper on CNN, I think Islam hates us. I thought, oh, this is different. Here's a president that's talking about Islam and Muslims in really negative ways that other presidents haven't talked about, And in the first Trump administration, you saw the travel ban that happened within the first week, targeting people from Muslim majority countries. You saw the issues there. And so that's where this book came out of. At Georgetown University, John Esposito is sort of the senior scholar for Islam in America, and he's talked about what he calls the normalization of Islamophobia, post the first Trump administration. And so that's where this book, One God and Two Religions, sort of came out of, to say, okay, when you have a president saying these kinds of things, when you have the negative kinds of images and impressions that you have of Islam and Muslims out there, how do you deal with that? How do you address that? And so the book is in 2 parts. The first part is just basic information. Who are Muslims? What is Islam? What is the Quran? Who is the Prophet Muhammad? And a lot of folks don't know, in the same way that you talked about Dalai Lama and Buddhism. And I use that as an example here. You live in Los Angeles, you know something about Buddhism. You've heard something about the Buddha. You know something about the Dalai Lama. Now, you may not know who the Dalai Lama is. You may not know, what what Tibetan Buddhists believe about the Dalai Lama and, that kind of thing. And so you might want to learn a little bit more. So the first half of the book, One God, Two Religions, is really talking about, the basics of Islam. The second half talks about the issues that come up, issues that are contentious. And so in the contemporary age, like images of the Prophet Muhammad, there's a very famous case a couple of years ago at Hamline University where art history professors showed some images of the Prophet that Muslims had made, not to be scandalous, not to be sensationalist, but in an art history class. And you had some Muslims saying, well, wait a minute, we can't do this. We don't show the Prophet, even though the images were made by Muslims, hundreds of years ago. And so there's sort of controversy over there. Salman Rushdie's Satanic Verses, I wrote my dissertation on part of that, 40 years ago now, can't the Muslim world take a joke? What's going on? Why is Ayatollah Khomeini, putting a death threat out on Salman Rushdie? But the kinds of things that you see now, like with women in hijab, some part of the mainstream, some not, who do you think of? What do you think of when you think of Islam? And then the violence and terrorism question. I mean, you see horrific violence that Muslims have done, but you see violence that non-Muslims, have done. I mean, we're taping this at a time where over the weekend in Vancouver, this attack on the Filipino community. Someone drives a truck through a parade and, kills at least 11 people, we see violence, we see horror, around us. How do we make sense of that? What do we do? And if what you see, and I'll stop here, if what you see is, if what you know about Islam is what you see on the television, it's a very different kind of thing. If the only Muslims you see are Muslims committing terrorism and violence on this television show or that television show, then you may be suspicious of your Muslim neighbor. How do you live with your Muslim neighbor? How do you understand that neighbor? And that's the subtitle of the book is Christians and Muslims as neighbors. It goes back to what we started with. We live in community. How do we live in community? How do we understand each other? How do we know our neighbor? You and I were talking about this earlier, and I'll stop here. That's you look at Canada, and one of the great things about Canada is the health system. The fact that we have socialized medicine in Canada, that like every other civilized country but one, America, healthcare is a right for its citizens, not a privilege for those who are employed. But we talked about, where do we get that from in Canada? Well, we get it from Tommy Douglas. We get it from the Social Credit Party. Tommy Douglas was inspired to do this because of his Christian roots in the social gospel movement. That, what does Jesus tell us in Matthew 25 about taking care of the poor, the sick, the needy, visiting those who are in prison, giving food to the hungry. So for Tommy Douglas, it's his Christian duty to take care of his neighbor. It's not his neighborly duty to take care of his neighbor, And so that sense of, how do you work in the world? How do you treat people as neighbors? That's part of the reason we have socialized healthcare in Canada. And I'm not saying there aren't problems with that. Of course there are problems.
No. But I think it's a very salient point. Right now, as we sit, the world is polarized by religious differences. The one that just blew up now is between India and Pakistan, for example. You could almost draw the lines between the Hindus and the Muslims, and just in that case, then you have the Middle East and what have you. But I was wondering, your book, how can emphasizing these shared roots build more resilient and inclusive societies? And specifically to your book, between Islam and Christianity, how can these shared roots, help draw us together, to educate us, to pull us together, to see, what, maybe we're not that different.
Right. So some of it is, and the book is written, like I said, the subtitle is, Christians and Muslims as neighbors. So it's really written about Christians and Muslims. And many Christians are surprised to understand that Jesus is important to Muslims, that Mary is important to Muslims. You can see this, but our listeners can't. Like, sitting, I'm in my office, and there's an image right here of Our Lady of Guadalupe, the Virgin Mary, the fact that the Virgin Mary is mentioned by name in the Quran. And so for me as a Muslim, Mary is important. So that's just one sort of small example, but it's really more about how you act and how you live in the world. So I had an uncle, South Asian, Pakistani guy, engineer, worked in petrochemicals, moved from New Jersey to Houston, moved to a very conservative sort of Baptist neighborhood in Houston. And he called me and said, "Look, you're a scholar of religion. I'm coming from New Jersey, where there's a lot of South Asians. I'm going to Houston, where there aren't a lot of South Asians at the time that he moved there. Most of my neighbors are going to be white evangelicals, Baptists. They don't know who I am. They're going to be scared. What do I do?" And I said, "Go knock on their doors, introduce yourself." He's like, "What are you, nuts?" And I'm like, "No, just do it." And he said, "Okay." And so, yeah, so you move into the neighborhood and you walk around the neighborhood and say, "Hi, I'm so and so, your new neighbor." And when they get to talking, I knew what would happen, because, like, "Oh, so you believe in God? You pray? You pray every day? You read your religious texts? You have sort of conservative religious values? Oh, you're actually more like us than you are." What we feared. Like, we feared, oh, this Pakistani Muslim who's going to come and, bring jihad or try to kill us. Oh no, this is actually a decent guy. And so I think that's it. As we get to know people, we get to understand, we got to live together. We got to work together. And do you know your neighbor? Do you work with your neighbor? Do you rely on your neighbor? Or do you fear your, and don't get me wrong, there may be reasons to fear your neighbor if your next door neighbor is psychotic. Yeah. That's a real issue. But I think, going back to what we started with, that's, for me, is the real sense of religion, is showing that commonality, showing that connection. We're connected to each other. We're connected with each other. And I hope the book can help a little way of helping to educate folks. And it does the opposite too, like in the sense of, it's written to help Christians understand Muslims, but it also helps Muslims understand Christianity. What is it that Christians believe about the world? Who is your Christian neighbor? Because again, if what you see, it goes the other way. If what you know about Christianity is right-wing evangelical who's protesting the funeral of a gay child or something like that, about the kid going to hell, well, that's not a particularly good form of Christianity, and that's not what most Christians believe. And so, it's as much about helping Muslims understand Christianity as it is helping Christians understand Islam. And I think in that way, helping us to work together, to live together.
Now, it's been such an insightful conversation because, what I'm pulling from this is that, we sit down with each other regardless of our differences, and we dialogue, we converse, we try to understand each other. And through that conversation, we see another human being across from us. Even though we have different beliefs, different faiths, different opinions, what have you, there are going to be commonalities. And it's from those commonalities that we draw connection, that we draw community, irregardless if we're from two different faiths or two different countries or whatever nationalities. But that's what ties us together. That's the connective tissue that I've wanted to talk to you about today, being a man of faith and myself a man of secularism per se, and to understand and draw that. And I think just this conversation is a living example how we can create these bridges between two different perspectives, and maybe they're not that different at all. Actually, there's more commonalities and similarities than there are differences and opinions per se. And I think it's been a very enlightening conversation for me, because what I hear is that whether it's religion, whether it's science, what have you, it's having the openness and the flexibility to adapt and to evolve and to take on different perspectives that can create more resilience and lessen the division. And I say this pragmatically. I don't say this theoretically, but pragmatically, having conversations with guests of your caliber or with my clients, because it's through this storytelling, through this sharing of sort of the inner dialogue, the inner what's going on with that, and then it's this conversation, this dialogue, this debate we can have, which is healthy. Well, we lead to something that is more of sort of, instead of divergent, but more convergent. At least that's my perspective that I've taken from this brilliant conversation today, Amir.
No, thank you, Jason. I really appreciate this, because I think that's exactly the heart of it. How do we help each other to understand each other, to know about each other, to live together? Because guess what? We're going to live together. Like I said, as a city kid, I rely on 100 people every day just for my existence, 99 of which I've never met,
Amir, is there any last thoughts you would like to live with our listeners today?
Yeah, no, I want to thank you again for the opportunity to be here. And I think for your listeners, that sense of, understand about each other, learn about each other, know that those stereotypes can be very useful sometimes to help us, but it can be very hurtful Other times that you might have more in common than you would think with someone who is deeply religious when you're not, or from a different religious tradition than you might be. But it really is that sense of, learn your own stories first. And then once you've learned your stories, help to learn someone else's stories. I think that's really what makes sense. And I'll stop here. I say this all the time to my students, like, look, you can read any book you want about Islam, including, one of the books I've written. You can read any book you want about Judaism, but do you get invited to a iftar by a Muslim friend to celebrate the end of the day's fasting? Do you get invited to a Shabbat dinner and see how your Jewish friend lives out their Judaism by just simply having a meal? Do we sit down at table together? And I think that's the encouragement for me. That's why I think what you're doing is so important. How do you get people together to talk to each other, ideally to be able to sit down across from a table and eat with each other, talk with each other, understand each other, because that's the only way we're going to solve things together, not as a collection of 7 billion individuals.
And so the book you've written it was launched this year, I believe, was One God and Two Religions.
Yeah.
And that's by Dr. Amir Hussain. Amir, thank you very much for a brilliant and insightful conversation today.
A privilege to be with you, Jason. Thank you.
I was struck by Amir's perspective on doubt, not as something to be feared, but as something essential. Whether we're talking about science or faith, well, questioning helps us grow. Amir so eloquently said that faith doesn't have to be rigid or blind. It can be visceral, it can be heart-centered and alive with curiosity, just like great science. They may ask different kinds of questions. Science seeks the how, while religion often explores the why. But both play a role in helping us make sense of the world and our place in it. We also discussed the importance of balancing belief with understanding and how religious traditions, including Buddhism, have adapted to evolving knowledge. Amir shared some fascinating insights on how even institutions like the Catholic Church consider psychological and medical factors before considering spiritual explanations. That is an excellent example of what faith looks like when faith evolves with humility and reason. We also talked about Amir's latest book, One God, Two Religions, which explores the relationship between Islam and Christianity. It's a timely and necessary reminder that education, empathy, and shared stories can chip away at fear and foster connection, especially in a world where divisions too often define us. I think that our conversation ended on a hopeful note, that dialogue and understanding are the antidotes to division, that listening to each other's stories builds not only bridges but resilience, and we all need more of that right now, no matter what we believe. Amir, thank you very much for such an enlightening and intriguing and compelling conversation. I appreciate your time and sharing your knowledge and your experience. Folks, if this conversation resonates with you, consider sharing it with someone who might appreciate a new perspective. And if any of you have got a guest in mind for a future episode, I'd love to hear from you. I'm always on the hunt for a great conversation. Well, until next time, keep well, keep strong, and we'll speak soon.